Dungeons & Dragons didn't just appear out of thin air. It was the result of decades of an evolution in gaming, a mix of strategic warfare simulations, collaborative storytelling, and the imagination of a few key visionaries. In today's episode of Dice, Dungeons & Dreamers, we're going to explore the origins of the world's most famous role-playing game, how it evolved from miniature wargaming, the brilliant minds that shaped it, and how a small set of booklets in 1974 would change gaming forever. Let's roll. Wargaming had a long history before Dungeons & Dragons emerged. Early versions of the hobby dated back to the 19th century, including Kriegsspiel, a Prussian military training tool published in 1824. However, one of the biggest turning points came in 1913 when H.G. Wells published Little Wars, a book that outlined a playful but strategic way to conduct battles with toy soldiers. Over the next several decades, wargaming evolved, with hobbyists modifying rules from Little Wars to include greater complexity and alternative scenarios beyond historical battles. In 1959, the game Diplomacy was released, a game of negotiation and strategy where players controlled nations rather than individual units. This game and the others before it influenced a young member of the Midwest Military Simulation Association named Dave Wesley to develop an entirely new approach to gaming. So in 1969, Wesley ran an experimental Napoleonic-era game set in the fictional German town of Braunstein. Unlike traditional wargames, Braunstein assigned individual roles to players, each with personal objectives. The game took an unexpected turn when players began negotiating and role-playing their characters rather than just engaging in military strategy. When two participants suddenly decided to duel, Wesley improvised combat rules on the spot. This marked a major shift from large-scale battles to individual, character-driven gameplay, something that fascinated one of the players that night, a young man by the name of Dave Arneson. After some time, when Wesley went away for military service, Arneson took over as the referee for the Braunstein games. In 1971, inspired by The Lord of the Rings, Conan stories, and the Gothic soap opera Dark Shadows, Arneson decided to fundamentally transform Braunstein into a fantasy setting and introduce new aspects to the game. He called this new fantasy campaign The Northern Marches, featuring the Barony of Blackmoor. Unlike previous war games, players explored dungeons, encountered monsters, and developed their characters over multiple sessions. To handle combat, Arneson adapted rules from a newly published medieval miniatures game called Chainmail, but he expanded upon that game with new mechanics including armor class and hit points. He also introduced the idea of a dungeon crawl, a core element of D&D today. Blackmoor became the first true role-playing game, and word quickly spread, and Arneson began talking to one of the creators of Chainmail, a young man in Wisconsin by the name of Gary Gygax. At around the same time, in the late 1960s, Gary Gygax had become a major figure in the wargaming community. In 1967, he co-founded the International Federation of Wargamers and launched a small gathering in his basement, which eventually grew into Gen Con, one of the largest tabletop gaming conventions in the world. And in 1971, Gygax collaborated with Jeff Pern to create a set of rules for a new game called Chainmail. Though originally a medieval miniatures game, Chainmail contained an appendix introducing fantasy elements, wizards, dragons, and monsters. Inspired by the rising popularity of fantasy literature, this edition allowed players to introduce magic into their wargames. The fantasy supplement was a minor feature at first, but it caught the attention of players looking for a more immersive storytelling. So in April of 1972, Dave Arneson traveled to Lake Geneva to introduce Gary Gygax and the Lake Geneva Tactical Studies Association to his game, which he called Blackmoor. Gygax was immediately captivated. Arneson's mechanics for dungeon exploration, character progression, and individual combat were unlike anything seen before. The two began collaborating, exchanging notes by mail and phone, refining the system into something more structured. Over the next year, they worked to formalize the rules into a new game, one that would revolutionize the hobby. Throughout 1972 and 1973, Gygax and Arneson refined their ideas, developing what they initially called the fantasy game. While brainstorming names, Gygax's youngest daughter, Cindy, reportedly helped them decide that Dungeons & Dragons had the best ring to it. To publish the game, Gygax and his friend Don Kay founded Tactical Studies Rules, TSR, in October of 1973, each investing $1,000. However, they still lacked the funds to print the game. To raise the capital, they brought in Brian Bloom, who contributed an additional $2,000, securing an equal stake in the company. The importance of this we'll get to in later episodes, but while Arneson was not involved in the daily operations, he was considered a co-developer of D&D and part of TSR early on. The first editions of Dungeons & Dragons was released in January 1974 as 3 booklets and sold as a set for $10. The initial print run of 1,000 copies sold out in less than a year, which was considered a mild success at this point. So in early 1975, TSR printed 2,000 more copies. The game had found an audience and word had started to spread. The game's early adopters were mostly wargamers, but as more people were introduced to the concept, it became clear that Dungeons & Dragons was something unique. Within only a few years, TSR would expand rapidly and the role-playing genre was born. The release of Dungeons & Dragons marked the birth of an entirely new genre, but this was just the beginning of its journey. The game would evolve, grow, and face challenges beyond anything its creators had imagined. In the next episode of Dice Dungeons & Dreamers, we dive into one of the most pivotal and dramatic moments in the story of D&D, the rift that forms between its two co-creators, Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson. What began as collaborative friendship and a shared passion for the imaginative storytelling and wargaming would eventually fracture under the weight of creative differences, legal battles, and competing visions for the future of the game they brought to life. So if you love gaming history and want to dive deeper into the stories behind Dungeons & Dragons, make sure to join me next week as we continue this journey through the wild and fascinating history of the world's most popular role-playing game. Share your favorite D&D story in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this video, please consider liking and subscribing. It really helps the channel grow and keeps the content coming. Until next week, may all your rolls be nat 20s.